It's Dave Vasilevsky, work for Evolving Web, and I'll be talking to you today about updating Drupal and how to make sure it works well by testing. You'll have to excuse me, I have a bit of a sore throat today, so let me know if it's not loud enough for anybody and I'll try and speak up. So just a basic outline of what we're going to talk about. It's going to be a bit of I'll tell you who I am, and then there'll be a bit of an intro to what are upgrades and what's testing and how do they work together. And then for a lot of this talk, we'll go over the tools that we use to do testing and to do upgrades and to make sure everything fits, and give you a couple of demos of how things work together to make it easier than it used to be. So I work for this company called Evolving Web. It's a Drupal consulting company out of Montreal. We do training, we do consulting, we do custom development, we do theming. We try to do a lot with the Drupal community. We've got a whole bunch of patches on Drupal.org right now, waiting for people to review. And we work on a lot of different aspects of Drupal. Some of the ones that I like the most are migrations. We've done a lot of those recently, custom search interfaces using Apache Solr, but we do all kinds of other things too. We have clients all over Canada and the USA, and we're hiring, so if anybody's interested in working for us, let us know. Here are some of the sites we've worked on lately from some pretty large clients, including the Linux Foundation, the Government of Canada, McGill University, and others. And one thing that we have a lot of is a training program where we run Drupal trainings, either public ones for just anybody who wants to come all over North America and occasionally in Europe. There was one here on Thursday. I hope somebody got to go. And we also do private trainings for companies who are interested in such a thing and want to teach their employees how to use Drupal and how to develop with Drupal. So yeah, let us know if you're interested in any of those too, or check out our website at evolvingweb.ca. So I'm Dave. I've been working at Evolving Web for quite some time now, almost 8 years, I guess. Long enough that I taught my coworkers about version control. It was Subversion back in the day. Now we're using Git like everybody else. And yeah, back then we were working with D6, and now we're working with D8, so it's been a bit of a journey. I participate in a ton of open source projects. Hopefully you've used some of those. And of course I work on Drupal core, and I'd be really interested in talking to anybody who has any ideas for things that they want to work on in core, especially about migrating. So let's talk about updates. Upgrades are really important for a lot of different reasons. Possibly the biggest reason is security. I mean, we all saw Drupal get in last year, where tons of Drupal sites got hacked. It was really not pleasant. And if you don't upgrade, you're going to be subject to all these security issues and going to be vulnerable. But upgrades are also, they don't just prevent terrible things, they also help with some things. They bring a lot of new features. Drupal 7 has a lot of features over D6. Now D8 has a ton of features over D7. Things like views integration and entity references built into core. And modules also, contrib modules, also gain features from upgrades. So if you upgrade to Webform 4 over Webform 3, now you have token support instead of the weird custom stuff that Webform was doing before, which is nice and convenient. One of the really important things is that Drupal 6 is now end of life. So there's going to be no more security fixes and no more features at all for Drupal 6 if you really need to be looking at getting off Drupal 6 if you're already on it. But a lot of us aren't really that good at upgrading. I mean, does anybody here have sites with modules that are out of date? Anybody? Hands? Yeah, that's including us, we still do. It's really not great. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One of them is some of us just don't know how to do upgrades well, which is, fine. When you start out with Drupal, you're not going to learn everything right away, and it's an important thing that you should learn to do. But then, even for those of us who know how, it's pretty annoying. It can take a long time to just run the upgrade sometimes, especially if you're doing a major upgrade from D6 to D8, let's say. And it can take time to find all the bugs, which will inevitably come up. You're always going to find issues when you do an upgrade that you just didn't expect, and you don't necessarily have time budgeted to deal with that. And then the way a lot of us try to find these bugs is by clicking around and just seeing, does this page work? Does that page work? What if I do this? And that's fine as far as it goes, but it's really painful. Nobody likes doing that. and it doesn't always find all the bugs. And so a lot of us just think we're playing it safe by not updating and leaving our sites vulnerable, which is not great. So I want to help people change that. I want to help people learn what to do and learn how to upgrade their site just at a basic level. I want to help teach people about tools that make it easier for them to update their site and to keep things working. And then I want to teach people how to do testing so that they can do this, they can feel safe when they update. They don't have to worry about what are they going to break. So I'm going to talk about some terminology now. Not everybody uses the same words for these, but usually at Evolving Web we talk about minor updates, which are module updates or core updates, but just tiny ones, like point updates. So in this case, like 7.35 to 7.36 of Drupal is a minor update. They'll usually have some security fixes, maybe some small features, or some like small bug fixes. But they're unlikely to be very complicated. Then there's major upgrades, which are upgrades like Drupal 6 to Drupal 8. They are really cool because you gain a lot of power when you update a version of Drupal, or a version of a module even. But they're also, oops, and there's a spelling error. They're also very, very risky, and they're very big. And so these are slightly different things, but a lot of the tools that we have are useful for both of them. So I'm going to talk about them together. So first, let's talk about minor updates. If you want to know when you have to update, there's a bunch of ways to do it. The way that is probably the easiest is just sign up for the Drupal Security Advisory's mailing list. They'll tell you when Drupal itself or a contrib module has a security vulnerability reported, and then you'll know when it's really important to update. You can also use the update module, which will give you this nice little list that you can sort of see at the bottom there. The resolution is not great. This little list about which modules are out of date, and let you know what you can update. A really important thing is never, ever do an update on prod. It probably won't break anything, but it might, and it's not worth dealing with. Do it on staging or do it on dev, and test the results before you go live with it. One thing you also want to be really careful about is if you made any hacks to contrib modules or to Drupal core. We all have to do that sometimes when there's a serious bug that's just sitting in the issue tracker forever. But when you do an update, it'll just overwrite whatever patch you made. So you have to be really careful about that. You have to make sure that if there's a hack that's important, that you after the update you put it back. There's a module called Hacks for Drupal 7. I don't know if it's around for Drupal 8 yet, but it'll help you find those hacks that you've made and which will help you after the upgrade process. So here's how to actually do an update. I recommend doing it with Drush. There's other ways, but it's probably the best. You can run, and the screen got hit.
That'll fix itself.
Oh, really? Okay.
All the rules have been doing that.
Yeah, I know. So you can run drush pm-update status, or drush ups, which will list all available updates for your site. And then drush pm-update will actually perform the updates, or just drush up. This is a short way to say that. For real site in production, though, you're not going to run drush up, because that could kill your production site. So instead, you'll do the update on dev and staging. After the update, you'll commit the updated, let's say, contrib module that you use. You'll commit those changes. You'll deploy you'll pull, basically, in staging, and test the results of the update. And then finally, you'll deploy in prod, and that'll keep you safe from any possible breakage. You should note that when you update something in Drupal, it doesn't just update the code, but it can potentially update the database too, because sometimes code will do something like add a new column to a table in the database, and it has to adjust the data that you have on your site. So there's a command called drushupdb that will run they'll basically run these changes. We'll say, oh yeah, I'll add another column to this table, or oh, I'll change the definition of this kind of data. You can also and so you have to run that after you do any update, or after you pull any updates onto a different site, onto staging or prod. It's quite important. You can also get there by using the update.php file if you don't like Drush so much. So now let's talk about major upgrade basics. The big rule about major upgrades is there's really no such thing as a basic one. They're a big deal. They can be basically as hard as rebuilding your site. Drupal changes in lots of ways, especially in Drupal 8. It's changed in so many ways, and it's not really backwards compatible. A lot of modules are making a really big effort to get current with Drupal 8, but some of them aren't there yet, including some really important ones like panels, let's say, or context. And so you're going to have a hard time if you're using any of those modules. So let's talk about different kinds of major upgrades. A lot of us are still doing D6 to D7 upgrades because that's one way that people can stay out of Drupal 6, can get out of Drupal 6, can get away from the end-of-life problem. And a D6 to D7 upgrade is often easier than a D6 to D8 upgrade. Some of the advantages are that a D6 to D7 upgrade you can perform in place on the existing site. You don't have to rebuild your site. And almost every module that's around is available for D7 nowadays. And if you have any custom code, they probably don't need such big fixes for D6 to D7 because a lot of the APIs are similar. So here's how you do that. In D6, you want to update your core and contrib to the latest D6 version. You don't want to upgrade them to D7 right away, but to the latest D6 one. And that'll make sure that they've done any adjustments that they need in order to make the D7 update easier. And then you'll want to take away all the things from the site that are going to have a bad upgrade path, basically. So that's probably any custom modules that you have, any custom themes that you have, and some contrib modules that just, because there are some D6 modules that never got onto D7. And what this does is it makes your site kind of smaller in scope, basically, and it makes it more likely that all the modules that you have will support upgrading. And finally, you'll update just the code for core and contrib to the highest available D7 version. You'll run drush-updb, and that'll do the upgrade in place. You can use a content migrate module to move your data from CCK to fields. Then you can find all the other contrib modules that you have and upgrade them. But when you do this, there's going to be some breakage, hopefully not too bad, but you are going to have to fix this. You're going to have to update your code, and it's not easy, I'm not going to lie. But now we have D8, and so you have the pleasure of running a completely different way of doing upgrades that you've never seen before. It's a lot harder, but a lot more rewarding. You can build your brand new D8 site completely from scratch, which is a lot of work, but you'll like D8, I promise. It'll be good. You can't keep pretty much anything from your D6 or D7 site. And then once you're finished building your site, though, you can migrate the content from your existing D6 and D7 site. So it's a different model from the way things worked upgrading to Drupal 7. Instead of keeping most of the code, you basically trash all your code and a lot of your site building, but you keep all the content comes along with you, and then you can just build a new site, which is a lot easier in Drupal 8 than it was in D6, so at least you've got that. So for a simple site, it's actually really not bad at all. You just create a new D8 site, and you install a contrib module called migrate upgrade, which will hopefully be in core in 8.1, maybe 8.2. You visit the /upgrade path, and you tell your new D8 site how to get to your database for D6 or D7, and then you just go. It pulls all your settings and all your content into D8. And you'll have a working site for some definition of working. A lot of things, basically your content types will be pulled in, your nodes, your taxonomies, everything will be there. But a lot of things aren't really working yet in D8. You're going to lose translations, unfortunately. We're working on it. There's still all your custom modules and themes, which are not going to work at all in D8. You're going to have to rewrite them, probably from scratch. And again, there's contrib modules like panels that won't be ready, and you'll have to find a replacement for them. But if you have a more complex site, you probably don't want to do it this way, because it's really kind of dirty. It pulls everything from your D6 site or D7 site into Drupal 8. So if you have things that you don't want to be in D8, those will come along too. Settings for obsolete modules will come along. Unpublished nodes that are just sitting there around wasting space will come along. It's probably easier to just build your new site from scratch and then get the content that you want from D6 or D7 instead of all the content that's ever existed. So you can run a command drush migrate upgrade -- configure, which will say, don't run all the upgrade migrations. Just create these upgrade migrations, and it'll put a whole bunch of config files into your site config. That'll all start with migrate.migration.something or other. And then you can just edit those, remove the ones that you don't need if there's content types you're getting rid of, add anything custom to the migration that you want, and then use the drush migrate import command from the migrate tools module. And this will just import the migrations that you've kept, just the things that you actually care about, and throw out the cruft. We found that to be a really good strategy when moving to D8. So that's a really brief overview of how upgrades work. Now let's talk about how testing works. There's a bunch of different kinds of testing that I'll introduce. Here's a quick overview. There's unit testing, which is the smallest layer of testing, where you're testing just one thing. Integration testing is testing a bunch of things together, but only some things. There's UI testing, which is basically testing how your whole site works in an actual browser. There's continuous integration, which is sort of orthogonal to testing, but it's making sure your tests always run. And then finally, there's another kind of testing, which I'm not going to talk about quite yet, but you'll see it later. So first, let's talk about unit testing. Unit testing is basically saying, I'm going to test one part of my program, one part of my site in this case, in isolation. So you'll take maybe one function or one class, and you'll write tests for just that one thing. It's great because you don't have to set up a site to do this. You can just test just a little bit of code. And you can say, you basically say, like, here's some input to my function, here's some output that I'm expecting it to give me, and then I'm going to test, does it give me that? And when you set up input and output like that, it's called using fixtures. So it's a really great thing to do. It'll help you make sure that when you work on your code, you don't break anything. And so I really recommend you do it for custom modules, or if you're contributing to code, it's really useful to have. I've listed the ways that you do this kind of testing in D7 and D8. You'll either write a test that inherits from Drupal unit test case in D7 or from unit test case in D8. Those are both PHP classes. But the thing is that unit testing is not really going to be a focus of this talk because it doesn't help you much with upgrades. When you upgrade a module, what you really care about is, how is this going to change all the other things that I have on my site? You can usually be pretty confident that if you update to a new version of a contrib module, that's not going to break much inside the module itself. The module has its own tests that you probably didn't write, and it'll probably work okay. But what's more concerning is when, let's say you're updating Drupal core, if it changes some behavior about how Ajax works, for example. That was changed recently in D7. Any of your code that uses Ajax might have to change. And so writing tests that test just your code won't help. You need tests that test both your code and Drupal and how it interacts together. So that's the next kind of test. That's integration testing. Integration testing tests how your modules integrate with other modules or with Drupal core. But it does this in a limited way. It only looks at the modules that are necessary for your module. You don't have to have a whole complete working site for this to work. So in D7, we used to use simple test for this. In D8, we have something called kernel test base, which is based on PHP unit. It's a lot faster. It's more powerful. I really recommend you use it. It lets you do a lot of cool things, like you can write code in your tests that enable modules, code that creates content, code that adds users, and code that even downloads web pages. It can be pretty slow, so there are downsides. And you can't test things like JavaScript or CSS, things that are presentational. You can only test basically PHP code. So it has limits. And possibly the biggest limit to this is you end up in this really weird state when you're doing integration tests, where you're testing a subset of modules and how they work together, but nobody ever actually runs that subset of modules. Nobody ever runs a site that is nothing but user, node, and nothing else, not even like system. It never happens. And so you're testing things in a situation that's really abnormal, where it's possible they won't work by design because code is looking elsewhere for things. So a way that we often get around that is with UI testing. UI testing basically controls a browser to go to your site and do things and see what happens. So this is your site working as a whole. It makes it really, really powerful. It can do CSS, it can do it can do JS, it can do basically anything a browser can do. So it's testing your site how it works in the real world. They're a downside. It's not built into Drupal, so you need some external tools like Behat and Selenium, which they're all different browser testing tools. Some of these may be built in 8.2. People are working on it. UI testing is basically like a great substitute for the clicky manual testing that you'd be doing otherwise. Instead of going to pages and seeing if they look okay, and then inputting forms and seeing if the result looks okay, you can just write tests that do that for you. And so you don't have to do the annoying part anymore. It makes upgrades much more pleasant. The downside is that all the previous kinds of testing we were talking about, like integration tests and unit testing, they isolate your code. And they make sure that your site as a whole won't break. I'm just going to run things in a special test environment. When you do UI testing, you're actually running your whole site. So if your UI tests do something like create a bunch of nodes, you have to make sure you clean them up afterwards, or they'll just stay on your site, and that's probably not what you want. So that's a whole lot of theory about testing, but what's maybe more interesting is how we make it work in practice. So what happens is we basically encounter a problem with our sites, and we say, how are we going to fix this? And a lot of the time it's been with testing-related tools. And so that's what I'm going to go over on a couple of different sites that we've used. So let me introduce the first site. This was an Internet of Things consortium, and they wanted to certify products that met their standards. They had a set of standards, and manufacturers would build products, and they would submit their products and say, hi, I think my product meets all your standards. And then somebody would have to test the product and eventually approve it and say, yes, this meets our standards, we're going to give it our seal of approval. So this site was really difficult to build for a lot of different reasons. We had really complex data. We often had forms which had some fields that depended on the values in other fields. So if you input a value, if you input the version of the standard that you were trying to implement in your product, if you're a manufacturer, that would limit the other things, the features that your product was allowed to have. We had sometimes custom data that was data types that don't exist in Drupal that we had to implement as our own field types, which is always a little bit risky. We were using field collections, which is compound data, saying that I want to have several different sub-entities of a node, let's say. So it really made forms super complex. And then in addition to that, different products could have relationships to other products. A product could be an update of one product. It could have another product embedded within it. And so we basically ended up with this form that was giant and scary and had tons of Ajax and JavaScript built into it and was constantly breaking. It had dozens of fields on it, and when you would change one, the values of a whole bunch of other ones would change, and then you try to change it back and different things would happen, and it would be constantly breaking. It was really confusing. And to make it worse, we had a whole bunch of different developers. And so often, some of whom were remote. So sometimes one person would change something, and the other person would change something, and together that would cause something to break. It didn't break for either individual. So it made it a difficult project. And it was one of the ones where we really decided we had to get serious about testing. So we started by using Behat. We said one of the big problems is this form is really complex. We're constantly breaking it. When we're making changes to one part of the form, it'll break another part. And we wouldn't even notice the changes because there were so many different features that were part of this form that it was just impossible to test it manually. So we started writing tests for it. We wrote tests using Behat, which is a tool that does what they call behavior-driven development, where you specify ahead of time what behavior you want your site to have before you've even implemented it. And then you write tests that test that behavior is really what's happening. And you expect them to fail at the start because you haven't written the code yet. You haven't actually made your site do that. But then you write the code such that the tests pass, and that's how you know that your code is good. It's almost like user acceptance testing, but you're writing it yourself to save your users the time. So we chose Behat over other UI testing solutions for a couple of reasons. First of all, it has integration with Drupal. It lets you do things like create a bunch of nodes behind the scenes and then test them out and then get rid of them after. So you don't have to worry about having junk on your site at the end. And it also uses a special language that's common in the Ruby world called Gherkin. which is a little weird, but it's human readable. You can have, you don't have to be a developer to understand how it works. You can have somebody who works in QA or a project manager write at least simple behat tests, which is really great because when you have the developer writing the tests for the code that they're writing, if they don't think of an edge case on the code, they're not going to think about it in the test either. If you have different people writing the tests in the code, then there's a better chance that you're going to catch problems. And Behat found tons of bugs on our site. It found a lot of update-related bugs. When we'd update a module, it would break our form. But it found tons of other bugs too. I mean, like, it's not always good to have bugs in your site, but it's good once you find them. So we're really glad we used it. So here's an example of what Behat tests look like. Yeah, we're finally at an example. This is a Behat test. You give it a scenario. Excuse me. And the scenario is just a name. It just says, what am I testing this time? And then you have a bunch of steps, given steps, which set up for your tests, when steps, which say, what are the things that you do, and then tests, which are the assertions, the claims that this is what I want to see happen. So this is a really simple one. It says, I'm viewing an article, which means create a new article with these attributes, which are a certain title, a certain author, and a certain body. And then there's a when step. And so Behat just takes care of that behind the scenes, the Drupal integration does. It just creates this node for you. And then you say when I do something. In this case, I'm going to move my mouse in this virtual browser that exists and hover over a certain region of the page. And then you say what should happen. I should see the text bar in this case. So I guess when you hover, it will look up the name of the user. So 2 of these steps are built into Behat for Drupal. The first one is we'll create the article, as I mentioned, and the last one will check for text on the web page. But the hover one isn't built in. So we have to build it ourselves, and it's really not hard. It uses this, and you have to do it in PHP. It does take actual code, but it's not the most complicated code because it uses this library called Mink that makes it really easy to write web-related code. So in this case, we just say the definition. Oh well, I should start with the attribute here. We have this. Can people see the highlighting? Yeah. Okay. So I have this annotation that says, here is how I say that I want to use this rule. I basically say, this is the text that should appear and that will invoke this rule that I'm writing now. So you see, when I hover over the author region, matches this, and the colon region is basically a wildcard. And then I implement the function that says, it's called I hover over region. It takes an argument, which is the wildcard here, and says, get the region, and then move the mouse over it. And that's how you implement a custom step in Behat. It's really not too difficult. And so we just wrote, like, I think we had 50 or so of these tests. And, I mean, more complicated than this usually. They would fill in the form and do all kinds of complicated Ajax things. And so whenever we wanted, we could make sure that the site was really working properly. So then we encountered another problem, which is that sometimes I would say, hey, I found this bug, and my other developer would say, I don't see this bug, what are you talking about? It works for me. And so we decided that the solution to this was to make sure that everybody was in the exact same environment. There's a bunch of different ways that people do this. Sometimes people use Vagrant for it. We decided to use something called Docker. It's kind of like Vagrant or other virtual machine solutions. It creates virtualized containers that hold your site, and that should be the same for every developer. And it builds them for you to make sure that they're the same. But what's different is that Docker is really lightweight. When you run a container with Docker, instead of taking, minutes to start up like it can with VirtualBox, it'll take about a second. So it's really easy. It's really helpful. And the best part about it is that if something breaks, you can just kill the container and run it again, and you're right back where you were before. So it's great when you're testing updates. You can just run the update, try things, run your tests, and if you're not happy with the results, you don't have to remember which database you were using before. You just kill your container and run it again. And one of the things we've tried to do with this is use it even in production. We use Docker both for our developers and for our production and for our staging too, actually, where our clients are testing sites. So that makes sure that if we find a bug in prod, we never have to worry about can we reproduce it in dev. We always can. Then we hit, oh sorry, I skipped a step. Okay, so here's a little brief introduction to Docker. Other people have given other talks about it. I think there was one yesterday. But if you just want a brief idea of what it's like, you write this Docker file, which sort of looks like what's down here at the bottom. It starts with a clean, come back? Yeah. It comes with it starts with like a clean Linux distribution, in this case Ubuntu, and then you can just run your Docker file like a bash script almost. Each of these steps that starts with a run is like a script. And it just says, in this case, install a whole bunch of packages, enable SSL, copy your code over. And you can also put any custom scripts that you need in it to do things like set variables on your site, if you don't have things featureized, let's say. What's really useful about Docker in comparison to other container tools like this is the Docker build process is cached. Every time it runs a step in this file, every time it runs a line, it caches the result of that. So if you change one line at some point, or if you change some of your code, you don't have to go all the way to the start to rebuild. It can take you, when we were using VirtualBox years ago, it would take us sometimes an hour to rebuild a site, which makes you really reluctant to change anything, even if it's bad. But with this, it'll only run the steps that are after the ones that you change. So sometimes it'll take just a few seconds to rebuild. Sometimes it'll take a few minutes, but it's never as long as it used to be. So that's one reason why we recommend it. But then the other problem that we had was that now that we had all these Behat tests and we had a Docker environment to run them in, which was the same for everybody, but still nobody wanted to run them because we're all developers and we're busy doing work and the client's on our back all the time asking why isn't this thing ready? And nobody wants to sit there while 50 different tests run. It could take half an hour sometimes. So we arrange for the test to run in the background. And this is what they call continuous integration. There's lots of services available that every time you make a commit, every time you push, they'll run all your tests. It's most helpful if there's a server involved that, so they don't have to run locally. They can run somewhere else. And it doesn't take your time or your resources. You just get a report afterwards, like, hey, there was a test that broke a half hour ago. Here's the commit that happened that caused the test to break. We don't know what's wrong, but you should look at this. And that really helps us get back up to speed. So we use a provider called Circle CI for doing our continuous integration. We really like them. They integrate with GitHub. So every time we get a pull request on GitHub, if we had a remote worker working with us, or every time we pushed, it would just automatically run our tests, and it would send us emails when something broke. So our project manager could go and find the developer who made the mistake and make them pay. It would catch a lot of bugs that we really didn't expect to happen at all. Like a server that we were relying on would disappear, and that would break all our tests. And we might not notice that if we had already had a build that was sitting around for a while, but because it would do the build from scratch every time, it would notice. Which is important because you never want a situation where your prod site breaks and you can't bring it back up again because it turns out your build process has been broken for months. And finally, Circle CI uses Docker. So when it finds a bug, it's always one that's also a bug on prod. When something's a bug on prod, it's always found on Circle CI, as long as we have a test for it. You can use other services like Travis, they're fine, but they'll run your tests in a different environment. So sometimes things will fail for reasons that you can't reproduce, and sometimes you won't find bugs that are really there in your production site. So we really like services that use Docker for this. So if you want to use Circle CI, you configure the circle.yaml file, which YAML is like a JSON-like syntax. If you're using Drupal 8, you've seen YAML. You just put this in the root of your Git repository, and in this case, it's pretty simple. It just says, it has a machine section that just says what should be on the box that it uses for testing. And in this case, we say we want it to have Docker. And that's all we need because we're going to build everything inside of Docker. And then the dependencies is what they call their pre-built situation. It's sort of designed for other programming languages, but it works for Drupal too. So we just say, forget what you normally do to install dependencies. What we want you to do is actually build our container in Docker. So this first command says build our site, and the second command says now run this new container that you have. And then finally, we would say to actually do the tests, we want you to, in this case, shush into the new container and run drush test run, which would run simple tests. Most of the time, nowadays, we're using other things. We're using Behat, but this is the essence of what a circle.yaml file looks like. And you can see it's not very complicated. Anybody can set up one of these. So now we'll do a brief demo of how we use these things and how we use them together. So there's a site we set up a while ago for the wedding of a couple of friends of the company. And so we have it already Dockerized. So can everybody see the screen, by the way? Is that okay? Yeah. So I'm just going to run our container, which works great. And now I should have the site available. Let's see. So it'll be a Docker 8080 in this case. When you build things in Docker, you give them a port to work at. So hopefully this starts up. Okay, great. So there we go. That's the happy couple. And you can see some features of this site. So it's a single page site. It's really simple, which is great for a demo because it gives me less to introduce. It has a little header here, which will take you down to the next section. And you can see that it has like an active section on it, a little oval that identifies the section that you're on. It also has a little form where you can say that you're going to show up. So let's say, and when you submit the form, you get a little thank you message. So it's a pretty simple site, not a lot of features. So we've configured Behat for this site. We decided we're going to have some tests, and then I have to find where the tests are. So I'm just going to go to the site, and great. So we have this behat.yaml file that configures Behat. This looks really complicated. The good part is that most of it is boilerplate. The whole thing up here about context, you just copy and paste that. You don't have to worry about what it means. The important parts here that we say, how do you access the site? We tell it, like, here's the URL that leads to the site, so that it knows how to contact the site. Because remember, it tests the site as a black box. Behat doesn't. It just runs a browser that talks to your site. It doesn't talk to the database directly like other kinds of tests do. So it needs to know like how to actually get there. And then we tell it where to run Selenium, which is a browser testing tool that actually knows how to run a virtualized browser. So in this case, I'm running it on my Mac, Selenium. So I'm going to start it up. Oh, I already have it started. Okay, it's just a Java program that I just have running. It's really not difficult to install. And then finally, we have to tell it one more thing here, which is this line. We tell it what a region on the site looks like. It's just a CSS selector, and it just means that our test can say, hey, get this region. And the Behat will have some idea what that means. So then we can look at the actual tests, which are in features, test.feature. So we have two really simple tests here. One of them says, submit the form that I just submitted. And so you can see this is totally human readable. It just says, go to the home page, enter a name, enter an email, click yes, hit submit, wait for the AJAX to finish, and then you should see a thank you message. And anybody can write a test like this. Then we have a second test, the second scenario, that says, when I visit the home page, then I'm clearly not in the lodging section yet. If you look at the site itself, when you go straight to the home page, you're not under lodgings. In the menu active, so the menu active region here is this part. So it says, when I visit this, then I should not see capital lodge. Sorry, it's not this whole thing. It's the one with the oval around it. So it says, when I go to the home page, then that should contain the little house icon, not lodgings. And then when I click lodgings and I wait for AJAX to scroll the page, then lodgings should be the active region. So it defines those two simple tests. So now I'll run the tests, which hopefully works. So you see it actually launches a real browser, in this case Chrome, and it runs a bunch of steps. They're all great. And something mysterious failed for reasons that I don't understand. Okay, let me try that again. Hopefully it works. No, we have this weird Java error. Okay, anyway, so that makes it a little harder to demo. I really don't know what's going on there. Most of the time, that works, except when I'm on stage. Anyway, the point is it runs both of these steps, and hopefully they both work. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. So we could do an upgrade. We could say, we could update the web form module. And after we do that, we would expect the test to continue working, and hopefully they will. Sorry, I'm just going to try a different way and see if that helps. Answer is no. What happened? So I don't run the test, so I should hopefully have at least similar results. Yeah. Okay, and I don't know what happened with the error, but the part that uses the form, which is the web forms, that kept working. So in this case, it proves that updating web forms to a new version, whoops.
It just does that every once in a while.
I noticed. I just want to make sure that I'm not explaining something that I'm not actually showing you about. So we see that when we updated the web form module, it didn't break the form part of the test. And so we can see what other updates are available on the site. So we can see what other updates are available. And you can see that there's a whole bunch of other things here. And one of them is Bootstrap, which we were using at the time we built the site in a beta version of 2.0, and now it's all the way on 3.5. So if I update that, I'll do -up, -y, bootstrap 7.x 2.2. So I'll update to the latest 2.x version of Bootstrap. And now when I visit the site, you can see that something's kind of wrong. These aren't looking the way they're supposed to. Because this update of Bootstrap, this module update, broke something about the site. And the test that failed before would actually detect this. And the good thing is that even though I can't demo it right now, we do have the changes on GitHub. We're using GitHub to demonstrate the site. So let me go there. So these different updates that we did, where we update all the modules, update web form, and update Bootstrap, we submitted all of these as pull requests. When you submit a pull request, if you have Circle CI integrated with your site, which we do in this case, Circle CI will test each pull request, and it'll run all your tests. So you can see when we updated to web form, it puts a little check beside things that say your test passed. When we updated Bootstrap, it put a little X that said they failed. And if we click this, we can actually see what failed. And we get this nice little Circle CI output. There's a whole bunch of different steps here that build the site and run the site and check if we can output things. So you can see the web form test is all green. Looks like it's passing. But the test for the header is failing. And you see these red steps that indicate what's going wrong. So one thing that I mentioned before was we like Docker because it helps us recover from problems. So in this case, we ran this update, and it did all kinds of things in the database, who knows what. And it broke something about the site, and we're not really happy with that. So what we can do is just say, I'm going to destroy the site, and then I'm going to run it again.
Stop marriage.
Yeah, that's really romantic. And so now after we wait a second for it to generate the page, it's all working again. So because of Docker, it kind of saved our lunch and it didn't break anything for real. We could just restart the container. So okay, that's a demo of what we do with Docker, with Behat, and with Circle CI, and how that can save your sites. So I'm going to talk about a second case study and some other tools that we used in this case. So McGill University had a course calendar, as most universities do, and it was still using D6 as of last year, and they really wanted to get it on D7. All right, so there were a lot of challenges here. They used a lot of custom modules. They had, again, really complex structure to their site. Each faculty, they had like basically a menu of all the different faculties in the school. Then each faculty had a sub-menu of all their programs, some of which themselves had their own sub-menus. And when you visited a page, we wanted to show the entire menu hierarchy down to where you were by pasting several different menus together. That's complicated. And then finally, they had a legal requirement that the content be complete, which is really like that. I'm not sure why we took the project, but it's not something you want to have to deal with. We had to be absolutely sure that once we did the upgrade, in this case a major upgrade, that everything was still working. So the first issue is that merging menus like this is really tricky. We'd keep writing code that did it, and it would mostly work except for some edge case, and it really wasn't what we liked. So we wrote a test with fixtures for this. This was back in Drupal 7, so it's a lot harder to do this. In Drupal 8 now, it's easier, and I really recommend you do it. But we wrote a single entry point to the whole menu merging system. We tell it, we want you to merge, like the user is currently at this page. Here's the menus that are relevant, merge it all together. And it wouldn't have to talk to the rest of Drupal at all to do anything. So that let us test it in isolation. We could just say, here's your input, here's the output that we want, make sure it works. And every time we encountered a case where it wasn't working, we would figure out what it should do, and just in that case, given that input, and just add it to the list of tests. And so in the end, we were able to get this thing that was kind of scary at the time to work well, and have confidence that it worked well. We actually set up these tests in D6, so that we could make sure that as we were upgrading to D7, at no point did it break. And then secondly, we had the problem that the code has to change. When you're upgrading a site to D7, everything's going to be different. But we really, really need the content to stay the same, or at least similar. And so we wrote this tool that we call SiteDiff. And what it basically does is it downloads a whole bunch of pages from different sites, and it finds the differences between them. Excuse me. When you're looking at Drupal sites, there's often things that are just differences that don't really matter. They're spurious. So, I mean, the domain name is an obvious example. If you're comparing the old version and the new version of a site, they're going to have different domains, and that'll be different. But that's not breakage. That's just how it has to be. There's things like form IDs in Drupal that are going to be different just because they're different every time. So there's functionality in SiteDiff to get rid of these things that are differences that you expect to happen. It has a command line user interface, so you can check things one at a time, or a web report that'll report on all the differences that exist. And one reason we really like it is it helps you break down the process of getting two sites to be almost exactly the same. Break down migrations, essentially, into simple tasks. You say, I've written some migrations. I think most things will work. Now let's see what the differences are. And then you say, oh, here's one class of differences. Every node of this type seems to be missing. Okay, so now I know it. I can create an issue for that and put it in my issue tracker. And I know to track that. And I'll know I won't forget about it because it's always going to come up whenever we compute a new difference, whenever we try using this tool again. So to configure SiteDiff is not really difficult. You tell it what the before URL is, the source site that you started with, the after URL, the site that you have created now, and then you give it a bunch of paths to compare. And it will look for each of these paths. It'll look on the new site and the old site, and it will make sure that they're the same. And then you can also give it a bunch of sanitization rules. In this case, this is a rule that just says, find anything that looks like a domain name, and just replace it with underscore, underscore, domain, underscore, underscore. So on both sites, if there are domain names, they'll look the same in the end. And you won't have to worry about one site saying d6.coursecalendar.com and one source saying d7.coursecalendar.com. That's not a real change. The output that SiteDiff gives us was something like this, a list of pages with some of them that are broken, that have diffs, some that are successful, and some that were just completely missing. And for each of these pages, it'll report what the actual diff was. So this is a real simple demo where it just says, there used to be a line that said there are 3 major airport services in New York City, and now there's an error that came from somewhere, and so it reports that was added. And so on the course calendar project, we're able to use this to crawl the whole site, compare it to the new site, take out things that weren't important, like theming changes, and then see what changed. And it really saved our bacon. So some of the reasons why we really liked it is it's really fast. It does web requests in parallel. So even though there were thousands of pages, we could just test them all. And it's really thorough. You don't have to limit it in any way. But it has some serious limitations. It can't really do anything with JavaScript or dynamic content. It's not going to help you if you have a website where people are constantly using complex forms, like the previous one I was talking about. This is designed for mostly static sites, but there are a lot of those out there, and a lot of us do update projects on them. And I think with D8 being out now and D6 going end of life, there's going to be even more of those. So there's definitely a use case for it. We found that, of course, it's useful for upgrades, like I just said, but it's useful for other situations too, for migrating content from even a non-Drupal source to Drupal. You can check that the original and the final version are okay, and unless you test that. You can test that your development boxes and production boxes are the same, and you can test that after you refactored code on an existing site, that everything's still the same as it used to be. So I'll do a little demo of how site diff works. So we don't need that anymore. So we have another site here. That's a pretty simple demo Drupal site. Okay, so there's not much here. All it is a new Drupal site with a couple of content types and an extra one here. And the way this extra content type was created was by installing the feature and then later removing the feature, which is a perfectly safe thing to do on older versions of Drupal. But it turns out on, I think it was Drupal 7.35, that all of a sudden broke. There was a giant issue on Drupal.org that you may have seen, where tons of people were reporting that their content types disappeared. And so that's a bad thing to happen to your site when you do a minor upgrade. But the problem is if you're not actually, like if it's a content type you're not using all the time, let's say it's for the video section on your site, which you only use occasionally, you might not even notice that it's gone missing. So site diff can help you find situations like that. So I ran our container, and now I'll show you how to actually run site diff. So we have this command, you can just run site diff, and it will soon, I hope. Right, so it'll tell us about the different commands that it has. And so what we're going to do is we're going to initialize site diff with our new site with this. So what it's going to do is it's going to crawl the site, look for every page that it can find that's accessible from there. It'll tell us what all of them are, and then and it'll store those in a cache. You can see that it has this cache file where it actually stores all the things that it fetched. So now you can make changes to the site, and it'll still know what used to be there. You can see that when I ran this command, it generated a sitediff.yaml file that contains the URL that we were interested in, and a bunch of paths that it found when it crawled the site, and then a bunch of sanitization rules that we built in to be useful for Drupal. These are things like finding form IDs and stuff like that. So if I run sitediff now, you'd expect there to be no changes because I haven't changed anything. But it's actually going to find some changes. You can see that there's a form on our site, and Drupal makes these form IDs that change every single time. And we don't really want to find these changes. They're useless. There's also the theme token in the Drupal settings, which changes every time. We're not interested in changes like that. We don't want to see them. So we can tell sitediff, instead of disabling all these rules that it have, you can see they all have disabled true set, that it should enable them. In this case, I'll just do that from the start. I'll reinitialize, and I'll say rules, yes. And now it'll rebuild it, but the rules are all enabled now. And now when I run sitediff, it's going to tell me that everything's successful, that my tests have passed in this case. So now let's do something simple and have an error that we expect to have. We'll create an article. Save it, and now we can see that it's on the front page. So now if I run sitediff, it'll detect this change. It'll say, hey, the front page is different. It used to say no front page content has been created. In this case, red is things that disappeared and green is things that are new. But then instead of that, this message, no front page content, there's a test article. So we're actually happy with this change because we did it on purpose. So we'll say sitediff store, which says, I'm happy with this, just store that this change was made, and that it's part of the baseline, it's part of the acceptable things that you want to see. So then, if I go to the site, you can see that I'm actually on an old version of Drupal here. The site is on 7.35. So I'm going to upgrade to 7.36 instead. As if like, this is what basically all of us did back when 7.36 was the new version. And now, if you were just checking by clicking around, you look at the home page and you say, everything looks okay on this site. It's nothing that looks obviously wrong. But if you do site diff, it'll find that things changed. Now, it's kind of hard to see what changed when you look at this. So we have a mode where it serves a bunch of changes. It'll say, here are the pages that are broken. It generates a web page, and here are the pages that worked. For each broken page, you can ask for a diff of what changed. So in this case, you can see that there used to be some lines about the lorem content type that are not there anymore. But looking at diffs like this can be a little confusing. So there's also a mode where it'll show you side by side. It's a little hard on this resolution, but it'll show you side by side the two pages, and you can see that lorem was here on the old one, and it's not here anymore. And this is kind of interesting because this page, like, it doesn't exist anymore. This is what used to be on your site. But we're able to serve it to you from the cache, so you can see what it used to look like. So we think site diff is really useful. We hope you use it, and we hope you use the other testing techniques. We'll put them all in continuous integration and keep your sites working even as you update things. Yeah, I think that's all I got. There's slides up on here, if anybody wants to see them later. And the demos that we had are all open source, and site diff is open source too, and you can see all of those and do what you want with them. Are there any questions? Yeah?
With site diff, would you ever recommend automatically deploying updates if site diff reports no problems? I certainly can imagine complex sites or really high value sites where you wouldn't want to automatically deploy. So say an agency is managing a large number of sites that are primarily
like brochure sites?
Brochure sites, yes. And I could imagine them thinking, well, we've got 100 sites, it's annoying to update Drupal 4 manually across the board. Could we trust site diff to run these tests, and if they pass, the robots automatically deploy the Drupal 4?
I think it's, I think you could. It depends on how much risk you're willing to accept.
Yeah.
Site diff will not check if your CSS still makes sense. Right? It won't check that your JavaScript still makes sense. So you probably want to have some other tests as well, whether they're BHAT tests or even just somebody like briefly looking at the site. But it certainly makes it easier than when you have to go and manually explore things. All the other kinds of tests that people talk about, whether they're integration tests or unit tests, they don't talk about content, but content is really important. And so that's why I think that tools like site diff and similar tools are probably a bigger help in this case than most of the other ones. But no, I can't promise you that it'll find everything. Any other questions?
We have one more.
Sure.
Could you show the definition of the BHAT step of wait for Ajax?
Oh, it's really stupid. You're not gonna
I'm just curious how you define that.
So, I mean, I don't. That's a built-in step, actually.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Where do I find it? Okay, unfortunately, I can't find it right now without bringing up something that's proprietary, I think. Or maybe I can. Let me see. It might be in that other site that we were just looking at. So while I look for that, does anybody have any other questions? What was it, Ajax to finish or something like that? Oops. Okay, great, it's in here. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Sure. Yeah, so here, it's really awful. It basically assumes that you're using jQuery to do your Ajax and looks for things that jQuery sets up to 5 seconds. So if your Ajax takes too long, it'll also just fail. But again, it's really not hard to customize these things if you have some kind of unusual Ajax that this doesn't find, that's cool. You can write your own replacement for wait for Ajax and use that. And we've done that in some cases. Like for autocomplete, we wrote a custom step that waits for autocomplete in a useful way, because this would often wait for you to select something with autocomplete, but then you had to select something. Like, yeah, you couldn't do it at the same time. You couldn't wait and also select something at the same time. So, yeah, no other questions? Then thank you very much.